Seoul and Tokyo are poised to commemorate their 60th anniversary of diplomatic ties next year, and in light of this upcoming event, the Yoon and Kishida administrations have pledged tangible efforts to enhance their partnership on regional and global matters. So what has been the history of their bilateral relations? And does history look to hinder improvements in bilateral ties? Also, to what extent do security concerns look to keep cooperation on track? Hello, it's Friday, June 21st here in Korea, and you're watching Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Come next year, South Korea neighboring Japan marks 60 years of diplomatic relations, and ahead of this occasion, we revisit the recent advances in bilateral ties and the tasks ahead. For this, I have Professor Choi Hyun Jin from Kyung Hee University here in the studio. Professor Choi, welcome.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Professor Lee Hee-eun at Handong International Law School live on the line. Professor Lee, it's good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Right, Professor Choi, for the sake of some background information on bilateral ties, perhaps we can start with the history of diplomatic relations between South Korea and Japan, including some of the major challenges, that is, prior to efforts by President Yoon Suk Yeol.
Yes, Korea and Japan have a very complicated relationship that goes back many years due to some historical events and also shared interest between the two countries. So they officially started diplomatic relationship in 1965 with their international treaty. They aimed to move past the memory of Japanese colonial rule that started from 1910 through 1945. And issues from this time, like the treatment of a comfort woman and also forced labor, they still cause problem between the two nations even today. And one big challenge has been how differently South Korea and Japan view their shared history. And South Korea has often asked for candid recognition and compensation for past wrong. But this has been occasionally met with resistance from Japan. And these historical issues also affect economic and also security cooperation, making it difficult to work together on trade and military matters between the two nations. And in addition, there is an ongoing conflict over some territory, like the Dokdo Islands, that still cause diplomatic tensions. South Korea is now exercising control over the Dokdo Islands, but Japan is still claiming these important islands. And so this led to some diplomatic tensions between the two countries. But I believe despite these historical issues, there's a strong need to work together, and especially considering threat from North Korea and the rising power of China. So this reality has led both countries to look for ways to balance addressing past issues with strengthening future cooperation. So we need a delicate balance between these two dilemmas. So President Yoon Suk Yeol's efforts focus on rebuilding trust and working together more closely with Japan. And I think this is a very future-oriented way of handling this bilateral relationship, while also dealing responsibly with the past.
Right. Professor Lee, as mentioned by Professor Choi, there was a dramatic turn of events last year when the Yoon administration took the first step, perhaps, to bridging the gap over differences. Could you remind us a bit about the key advancements in ties in recent times?
Right. So President Yoon came into power basically trying to shift the foreign policy of Korea more towards, further cooperation with Japan, of course, and the United States. And here, President Yoon really staked his foreign policy on moving forward in terms of a relationship with Japan. Despite all the issues, as Professor Choi mentioned, with respect to the past, President Yoon's administration really was focused on looking at present interests as well as the threat of North Korea, and then, basically proposing a series of meetings. And that first meeting last year with respect to the summit meeting between the Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida, and President Yoon was really important because this was the first visit by a Korean president since basically 2011. And then that quickly followed with a meeting of course, by Prime Minister Kishida to Korea, basically, where they sort of developed I think a very close personal relationship, and basically shifting the nature of sort of this relationship, going from more of something in terms of confrontation, but more towards active cooperation. And so that sort of culminated with the at Camp David. There was a summit, of course, with President Biden. And that sort of really solidified the relationship, I think, between the two sides, Korea and Japan, going forward, because here, there was sort of this idea that now Korea and Japan would sort of go hand in hand, especially coordinating themselves with respect to security matters. And so that, of course, these kinds of further relationships between these two men, continued on through various international conferences. Even with the G7 summit in Hiroshima, the president and the prime minister were together, seen and pictured together, doing various activities, which again portrayed the public image that the two sides have sort of moved beyond something in terms of what the past was dealing with, but now sort of a future-oriented relationship. And I think that's been sort of the path the two sides have taken ever since.
Right then, as Professor Lee mentions, as the two leaders seek to take their relationship from confrontation to a greater collaboration, Professor Choi, there are some, though, who claim that bilateral relations remain on rocky ground, given the differences over history that you mentioned earlier. Do tell us more about that.
Okay, so as Professor Lee explained, so both countries have made some positive steps in improving their relationship, especially under the Yoon Suk Yeol administration. So they are working together more in areas like trade and security, recognizing that both can benefit from this strong partnership. But however, as you mentioned, the history between the two nations still affects their relationship today. The painful memories of Japan's colonial rule over Korea, and also ongoing disputes about how history is remembered and taught, make any progress in their diplomatic ties quite delicate. For example, let me give you one story of some diplomatic tension between these two countries. So nowadays, Japan is trying to make the Sado gold mine as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But however, the South Korea is opposing this because Korean first laborers during the World War II were used at this gold mine. And this is a very painful part of Korean history. So this shows some different position between the two countries. So even though diplomatic relations seem to be improving, they are still at risk of facing setback due to these historical issues. So I believe that respecting each other's history and also looking ahead are necessary to make sure these diplomatic efforts don't break down. And the challenge for leaders like President Yoon Suk Yeol is to maintain this positive momentum in this relationship with Japan, while also addressing the past historical issues. And I think this is a very challenging task, but it's very important for the lasting peace and prosperity of both countries.
Right, which is something that pundits have been saying as well. Professor Lee, so while history hinders bilateral ties, pundits claim that broader security concerns perhaps will keep South Korea and Japan close together. Based on what you said earlier, I'm assuming you probably agree with this outlook.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the regional security matters obviously are going to play a huge role in terms of how Japan and Korea sort of move forward, especially during this time when you have the Prime Minister and President Yoon sort of in power. And so here, most notably, we're looking at the issues of North Korea and missile testing and nuclear proliferation. And, with the further cooperation between Russia and North Korea recently in terms of their security pact, I think there's a really big challenge here because, with respect to, what's happening in the region broadly and what may happen, of course, in the presidential election in the United States, Korea and Japan may find itself in a position where they have to find closer ties and may have to sort of count on themselves between themselves as opposed to, the United States being there all the time. So here, I think, given the context of security in the region, that has always sort of been a point where Korea and Japan have had to sort of, even if they didn't really want to in the past cooperate, the broader concerns, the geopolitical concerns really have constrained their sort of relationship in terms of having to work together at some level, even if the past issues have been raised. And so whether it's a progressive administration or more conservative administration in Korea, I mean, the broader context has always sort of created some sort of issues with respect to how Japan and Korea have been able to cooperate with each other. So I think that's really been the dynamics of Korean foreign policy in the last, since the end of the Cold War until today. So I think we're going to see that more and more of that. And I think the X factor here will be what happens in November in the United States.
Right, following the presidential election there then. Moving beyond history and security, Professor Choi, there are hopes for greater economic gains amid closer cooperation between South Korea and Japan. What more can you share with us?
Okay, so Korea and Japan can work together to improve their, as you said, economic relationship, especially in areas like a global supply chain, where both countries hold strong positions in high-tech industries, such as electronic cars and semiconductors. So these high-tech industries need reliable supply chain to operate smoothly. So by collaborating, the Korea and Japan can make the supply chain more stable and efficient. For example, they can jointly reduce their dependency on China for essential materials like rare earths, which are very critical for the technology sectors of both countries. Since we don't have this kind of resources, so we can work together to source and develop this material, especially during global disruptions like pandemic and also political tensions. And moreover, there's a significant potential to increase the trade between the two nations. So reducing tariffs and making it easier to trade helps increase the exchange of goods and services. So recent efforts to increase trade relationship after previous challenges with the Japanese export control shows some progress in this direction. And tourism and also cultural exchange also provides some economic opportunities as well. So both countries have a rich historical and a popular culture that attract visitors from each other. So enhancing tourism opportunities, for example, easing the visa process can improve understanding between the peoples of both countries and also boost economic activity. So I believe focusing on this area, the both countries can build a strong economic partnership that somehow helps overcome the troubles of a past history.
Right, hopefully, of course. Professor, come next year, as I mentioned earlier in the clip, the two countries celebrate their 60th anniversary, and ahead of this commemoration, some are suggesting fresh efforts to completely reset the tone of bilateral ties to ensure that history does not reverse current improvements in relations. That being said, what do you propose?
So there's been, as Professor Choi was noting, in terms of increasing essentially people-to-people interactions between the two sides, the more understanding there is between both societies in terms of engaging each other, I mean, there's going to be more synergies and much more better relations that are going to be developed between the populations of each side. So I think tourism certainly does that. When more people visit from Korea to Japan and vice versa, there's going to be more opportunities of greater understanding, and then greater interest in terms of Korean culture and in Japanese culture. So I think the tourism sector, is very much an area where I think a lot could be done. And just as Professor Chen noted, easing visa issues, right, allowing people to travel more freely between the two sides in more of an open way. But also not just sort of in the tourism area, on the educational sector as well. There are lots of young people obviously studying in Korea and Japan, and there could be more done, I think, in terms of encouraging study in Japan or study in Korea, particularly because Korean culture, Korean history, Korean language has become much more popular, I think, in all parts of the world. But it's specifically in Japan, developing sort of within Japanese society a greater interest in Korean language and Korean culture, and allowing Japanese students to experience studying in Korea, I think would do a lot in terms of formulating sort of perceptions of Korea, and vice versa for Korean students to do that in Japan as well, at major universities. Because I think once this next generation is able to engage each other in a more proactive way, these are the next generation of leaders who will then have a better perception of each country. So I think that will be very good as well. And then maybe lastly too, sort of on the employment side, there could be more done in terms of encouraging, people with respect to, working in Japan on the Korean side, but also on the Japanese side, working in Korea. So that could, potentially allow for this idea that you could recognize credentials from each side, and then which allows for better freedom of movement with respect to people working and living in each of the respective countries. So I think that aspect of things can be improved and would be, I think, a great benefit for both countries.
Right, by targeting education and employment at the same time. Professor Choi, what do you suggest to further facilitate a future-oriented relationship between the two countries?
Okay, so I think we need to somehow focus on some social issues. So there are the common social issues faced by both countries. So here are a few areas for better cooperation between Korea and Japan. The first one is joint social initiative. The Korea and Japan, they both deal with issues like low birth rate and also phenomenon of social isolation. And this is called hikikomori in Japan. And we could work together on research to better understand these issues and create effective social policies. And this cooperation could include some exchange of experts and also holding joint conference and also pooling resources for new solutions. And there is another area, technological solution for social challenges such as growing senior population. So both countries are leaders in technology, and which we can use to address social problems like caring for our growing older population. So we could collaborate on projects such as robotics, AI healthcare, and also smart home technology that can help older people live more independently. And also, the last area is an environment. So we face common environmental challenges like air quality and also sustainable energy. So working together on these issues can help improve the lives of our citizens and also show how we can achieve common goals through cooperation. So based on these strategies, I believe we can build a strong partnership that can set the foundation for more cooperative future.
Right. Professor Lee, what do you believe is the significance of favorable ties between South Korea and Japan for the broader global community?
Well, I think, one of the biggest areas, I think, for Korea cooperation with Japan will be, this idea of a rules-based international order and basically, Korea's role as a global pivot state. Because, the fact that Korea is engaging Japan and sort of looking forward to, looking at democracy generally and working with other democracies in promotion of human rights, international law, the rule of law generally in the global community, I think this sort of cooperation looks at, I think, that potentiality for Korea in terms of taking some leadership here. So I think with Japan and Korea improving their relationship, there's been talk, of course, about even, the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Because of this sort of activity between the two sides and engaging each other and moving beyond what happened in the past. And so I think that bodes well in terms of, this image for Korea and Japan that, these are two leading countries in the world that want to take greater leadership in what the world does and setting the tone for, greater sort of peace and prosperity. But again, looking at sort of the overall questions about how do you address, things like, confrontation and, armed conflict in other parts of the world. Whereas, these two countries together sort of walking forward, I think offer a new paradigm for this sort of new order in the international society.
Right, especially amid President Yoon Suk Yeol's hopes of nurturing Korea into a global pivotal state, of course. Professor, as always, thank you so much for your valuable insights. And Professor Choi here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.